Welcome back to the Universalis podcast. I am Martin Kochański, the creator of Universalis, and in this episode I'll be looking at the highlights of the week ahead, starting with Sunday the 23rd of February. As you will have gathered from the tail end of last week's episode, I am in two minds and two places just at the moment. On the one hand, I'm thinking out and recording what I'm going to say to you in this podcast. On the other hand, I am also aware that I am due to speak at the Word on Fire conference in London on Saturday the 22nd. As I speak, that is in my future, and it's probably in your past by the time you listen to me. It is all rather bewildering. I wonder what I will have said at the conference. By the time you hear this, I will know. Last week I was going into the Office of Readings, and for a change I was looking at the week's first readings, that is to say, the biblical ones. It turned out that they were all readings from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs is rather a dull title, but there are treasures in that book, so there was a fair amount to talk about. The book of Proverbs is also the first of what are called the wisdom books of the Bible, and the wisdom literature as a whole is a fascinating part of Scripture. It marks the time when the Jews, who know God so well, also start to think about him. This week the theme of wisdom literature continues. In fact, it intensifies because the weekday readings at Mass this week are from the book of Ecclesiasticus, or Sirach as some people know him. But I will stick to the Office of Readings, whose first readings this week have moved on from Proverbs to the book of Ecclesiastes. There are phrases from Scripture that people know even if they have never opened a Bible. One of them comes at the very beginning of the book of Ecclesiastes. "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "All is vanity." It sounds clever. It sounds world-weary and rather cool. It sounds like a school friend of mine who at 14 used to go round saying, "Life is a drag," and we all rather admired him for it. There is nothing like a pose of elegant cynicism, even pessimism, to impress everybody. So we admire the author of Ecclesiastes for that, and we don't bother to read the book to see what he is really saying. Quotation is so much more fun than actual reading. Fun, but not true. I have just listened to all the passages from Ecclesiastes for this week. I did it like this. I went to one date after another, and for each date I pressed play and then pressed the skip to a track button to go to the first reading. If you've got an audio subscription, do that. If you haven't, scroll to the first reading and read it out loud yourself. Why? Because words, when spoken, come at a natural pace and the mind can absorb them. On the other hand, if we just read the screen in the usual way, then we speed read it. We bounce over the surface and miss out the depths. On Sunday the 23rd, the book of Ecclesiastes opens with those resonant words, "Vanity of vanities." The preacher is thinking about value, the value of human activity, the value of nature. He wonders what value these things have in themselves, so he asks of each of them what sounds like a natural question. What does it all add up to? To use the language of business, one might say, what is the bottom line? On Sunday, the answer to that question is nothing. What it all adds up to is nothing, because nothing ever comes to a conclusion where you could draw a line under it and say, here it has ended. One generation of mankind follows the next. The sun rises, the sun sets, the sun rises again. The rivers flow into the sea, and the rain rains back into the rivers. It all goes round and round forever. There is nothing new under the sun. Whatever happens has happened before and will happen again. So any attempt to answer what is the bottom line has to fail because there is no bottom under which that line could be drawn. On Monday, the preacher tries the same exercise on a different scale. Instead of cosmic time, he now looks at the timescale of a single human life. There is a bottom line now because there is a bottom. But what is that bottom? It is death. And where is value then? The fool's fate, I thought to myself, will be my fate too. Of what use my wisdom then? This too, I thought, is vanity. Since there is no lasting memory for wise man or for fool, and in the days to come both will be forgotten, wise man, alas, no less than fool must die. What is done under the sun disgusts me, since all is vanity and chasing of the wind. When the preacher looked at the world as a whole, nothing added up. When he looks at a human life, it does all add up to nothing. But look at what the preacher deduces from this. It is not that all is pointless. It is that what does it all add up to is not the right question to be asking. The end of Monday's passage is wonderfully consoling to anybody who thinks and worries too much. There is no happiness for man but to eat and drink and to be content with his work. This too I see as something from God's hand. There is value, after all. It does not inhere in bottom lines, but in normal human activity. It lies in what we are doing, not in what we have achieved by doing it. It all has value, and value comes from God. These are almost the first references to God in the book. Tuesday's reading starts with a wonderful litany. All kinds of human activities are listed, and all are accepted in that there is a time for each of them. There is a time for giving birth, a time for dying, a time for planting, a time for uprooting what has been planted, a time for throwing stones away, a time for gathering them up. There is a time for embracing, a time to refrain from embracing. This is one of those passages of the Bible which are just too beautiful. There is nothing that can be done about them. Having come to the end of reading this litany, preferably out loud, the only thing you could possibly imagine being worth doing is beginning again at the beginning and reading it all through again, but louder. What actually does follow is a good, solid piece of theorizing about the limits of philosophy itself. Though God has permitted man to consider time in its fullness, man cannot comprehend the work of God from beginning to end. The position of God in the book of Ecclesiastes is a little odd. In the passages we are reading this week, there is nothing of the long history of the covenant and God's relations with his chosen people. There is no Moses, no Pharaoh, no Red Sea. I think this is because the wisdom literature in general marks the Jews' encounter with Greek philosophical thought. The Greeks have no historical relationship with God. We do. So in Ecclesiastes we have a Jew trying this out as follows. On the one hand, let's reason philosophically in the way the Greeks do in their ignorance of God and see how far that takes us. On the other hand, let's then see what we can add, since as Jews we know God where the Greeks don't. What more can we add, and where will that take us? The preacher does this. He looks at wisdom in the Greek sense and sees that it too is vanity. It adds up to nothing in the end, because it too only goes a certain way and then stops. By seeing how far philosophy on its own can take him, the preacher can see clearly that there is no true value except in God. What the preacher says about considering time and comprehending time is the first fruit of this. All the things that he says are not vanity are located firmly in time. They are in the present. Eating and drinking and being happy in one's work. If you follow that thread into Christian theology, you get good, solid spirituality. The present is the only time that is truly real. The past is frozen and the future doesn't exist. The present alone exists. It is complete in itself, not containing any flow of time. It is real, it is indivisible, it is the moment in which we touch eternity. Once again, the preacher reverts to a sense of value that is grounded in simplicity. I know, he tells us, that there is no happiness for man except in pleasure and enjoyment while he lives. If you stop there, the preacher could be any pagan poet, but he doesn't stop there. He goes on. When man eats and drinks and finds happiness in his work, this is a gift from God. On Wednesday, the preacher talks about the vanity of riches, but this isn't any lazy sermonizer's equation of poor equals good and rich equals bad. The point about riches and accumulated goods, the point about their pointlessness is this. They purport to be a bottom line that defines value. But because life ends, no bottom line can ever have value. Good things in themselves, seen rightly, are indeed good. As the preacher says, Whenever God gives a man riches and property with the ability to enjoy them and to find contentment in his work, this is a gift from God. Do you hear one particular word coming into these simple phrases? Like when you listen to a peal of church bells ringing, and for some reason just one bell comes to your attention in all that fabric of sound? Just one bell. It is this: work, work, work. Listen out for it, and you'll hear it sounding again and again, and every time work is something that gives enjoyment, gives contentment, is even a gift from God. We sometimes think that work is a curse. It is a punishment for the sin of Eve and Adam, that they should labour by the sweat of their brow. But let's distinguish. It is not the work or the hardness of the work that is the curse, it is the laboriousness of it. It is the worker being out of tune with the work he does. I have a friend who used to be a farmer, and when he had done all the hard work of the day, what made him happiest? Finding something more to do. Modern society has taught us to forget this. Perhaps that is partly because so much that is called work is actually pointless and a waste of time. We do it only because if we don't do it, they won't pay us. We are blackmailed into it by the threat of hunger and homelessness. The work, work, work ringing through Ecclesiastes is a sign that work in itself is good, not bad. The Church in her social teaching expands on this theme. In 1981, Pope John Paul II published an encyclical, Laborem Exercens, focusing precisely on human work, which he would have hardly done if work itself had been a bad thing. It is one in a sequence of church documents valuing work which started 90 years earlier with Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, something which incidentally was heavily influenced by Cardinal Manning, whom I talked about a month or so ago. God did work in making the universe. When he gave us the universe so that we could be masters of it, he gave us the honour of being co-workers with him. Some sense of the goodness of work begins to come from that. Seeing how the preacher regularly puts work with the pleasures of eating and drinking and so on, you can see that he is thinking some of the same things. That was Wednesday. As for Thursday onwards, I will leave you to go through the rest of the readings from Ecclesiastes slowly and thoroughly. It is studied with phrases you will remember. On Thursday, like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of a fool. On Friday, better a live dog than a dead lion. On Saturday, the conclusion of it all. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. But you know now that there is more to reading Ecclesiastes than the memorable phrases. Meanwhile, I still have the Word on Fire conference to think of, and Ecclesiastes ties in with the conference in a way I hadn't at all expected. People are bound to want to know how Universalis started. We all know, or we think we know, how projects start. A team comes together, a business plan is written. There are market assessments, projections, models. There are clear goals with timescales attached. There are policies for everything. Once the thing gets going, there's monitoring, there are key performance indicators, there's a whole new language, a whole specialized vocabulary, and I have only touched the surface of it. The preacher has taught us one simple word for all this assessment of value, all these bottom lines. Vanity. What the preacher puts in its place is simple. Here it is. There is a time for everything. When it is the time for doing something, do it. Do your work, he says, and, he adds, enjoy it. In a world dominated by the idea of scientific business administration, I used to feel a little shy about admitting how Universalis had really started, but reading Ecclesiastes I take courage. I can tell the real story. I was drunk. That was the start of it. It was Easter Day, 1995, the Easter retreat at Downside, and I was drunk on the spirit from the Easter Vigil the night before, then drunk even more on the glory of the resurrection at the Easter Sunday Mass itself. All my inhibitions were gone, and when I reeled into the Abbey bookshop and saw a second-hand 3-volume set of the Liturgy of the Hours, I was too intoxicated to be prudent and think what it might do to me. By God's mercy, I was lucky. It did not make me a monk or a priest. All that the Liturgy of the Hours did to me was this: it made me fall in love with it. I was knocked flat by what I found, especially because the second readings for the weeks after Easter were showing me from all sorts of different directions how people of all kinds had dealt with the stunning fact of the redemption. There is no better place to start. When I sobered up a little, my first question was, why doesn't everyone do this? And the answer was there in front of me, in 3 volumes adding up to some 5,000 pages printed on very thin paper, complete with intricate instructions for their use. For some reason which until that moment had been obscure, I had made my career in computer software. Now the point of that vocation became clear. God does in the end tell you why he has let you do certain things. For a computer, 5,000 pages was no discouragement. After all, bytes weigh nothing, and the intricate instructions were no trouble. Computers love algorithms. So I was faced with something that needed to be done, and I had discovered that I was able to do it. So I did it, and now Universalis is what it has become. I have told this story here because some of you need to hear it. Some of you may have a clear idea of something that is worth doing, needs doing even. As long as you think that things can only be done by organizations, by business plans, all the rest of it, your idea will sit in your head and never grow. If you forget all that, if you think simply, this needs doing, I'll do it, wonderful things will start to happen. You will be taking all that you are, all that you have become in your life, and giving it to God. Not in a saint-abandoning the world kind of way, but in a real way nonetheless. And one way or another God will respond. He may send you prosperity or adversity, I don't know. People may come out of the corners where they've been hiding and join in with you where they never dared before. Try it and see. Don't be discouraged if you aren't qualified with the proper training courses. The saints weren't. Learn what you need to and ignore the rest. Don't be discouraged if the thing you are tackling is too big for you. Do what you can. If you can only help one person, that is one unique soul created intentionally by God to be part of his universe, and you have been of use to Christ in that person. Isn't that glory enough for you? If the devil tells you 1,000 people needed help before you started, and now you have finished 999 still do, ignore him. Ecclesiastes has taught you the futility of measuring value by means of the bottom line. Never just sit around thinking that something ought to be done. That's all for this week. If you'd like to write to us about anything, send an email to universalis@universalis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week in every sense, and let's pray for one another.